I woke up that Saturday morning expecting a peaceful day, maybe some coffee on the porch, and a little yard work if I felt ambitious. What I didn't expect was the sight of a full construction crew hammering away in my backyard like they were building Noah's second ark. I nearly dropped my coffee when I saw it. A huge wooden shed was already half up, sitting proudly a good 6 feet onto my property. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was still dreaming, but the sound of nail guns and the smell of fresh lumber confirmed it. It wasn't a dream. It was a nightmare with a Hammer soundtrack. I stormed outside in my slippers, heart pounding, trying to process the absurdity unfolding right before my eyes. And that's when I saw her, Karen from the HOA, standing smugly on the other side of the fence, hands on hips like she was overseeing the construction of a royal palace. Right there, at that moment, I knew today was not going to be peaceful. Today was going to be war. Still reeling from what I was seeing, I crossed the yard and flagged down one of the workers, a guy in a neon vest and hard hat who was casually sipping a soda. He looked at me with the detached patience of a man who had answered far too many dumb homeowner questions. I asked him why in the world he was building a shed on my property, and he shrugged like it was the most normal thing in the world, telling me, "Talk to Mrs. Karen. We just build where we're told." I stared at him, blinking slowly, trying to control the volcanic rage boiling inside me. Instead of throwing a fit right then and there, I bit my tongue and decided to play this smart. No sense screaming at hired hands who were just following orders. No, the real target was standing smugly across the yard in her Live Laugh Love t-shirt like a suburban warlord. Later that afternoon, after the workers packed up for lunch, I approached Karen directly. She looked almost bored when I asked her what she thought she was doing. With a tone so condescending it could curdle milk, she informed me that the HOA had decided the empty lot space next to my yard was community property, and that they were building a shared storage shed for neighborhood equipment. I blinked at her, stunned at how casually she lied. I pointed out that the land she called community property was clearly inside my fence line, complete with my property markers still visible in the grass. Karen just gave a tight little laugh and said, "We all have to sacrifice a little for the good of the neighborhood." She actually said that, like I was supposed to just hand over a chunk of my land because she felt entitled to it. I had to physically clench my fists to stop myself from saying something that would have gotten me fined for public obscenity. That night, after the sun went down and the sound of hammers finally ceased, I pulled out every dusty document I had tucked away in my office. Property maps, deeds, HOA agreements, you name it. I laid everything out on the kitchen table like a general plotting a battlefield strategy. It didn't take long to confirm what I already knew. The shed wasn't just a little over the line, it was a full 6 feet onto my land. The deed was crystal clear. My land, my rules. Karen had absolutely no legal claim. But here's the thing, tearing down the shed right away would have been easy. Calling a lawyer and throwing a fit would have been satisfying. But it wouldn't have been nearly as delicious as what I had in mind. See, I wasn't just mad, I was inspired. Karen thought she could build on my property without consequences. She thought she could manipulate, lie, and strong-arm people like me into rolling over. But what she didn't know was that she had just built me a brand-new, fully functional rental property, for free. I didn't have to lift a finger or pay a dime. It was sitting right there, practically gift-wrapped in arrogance and plywood. I spent the rest of the night crafting the perfect rental listing. I took some slightly artsy photos of the shed under the evening sky, carefully framing it to make it look larger and more attractive than it was. I wrote a glowing description too, emphasizing the brand-new construction, secure suburban location, and convenient access to local parks. I didn't outright lie, but I stretched the truth so thin it squeaked. When I hit post on the ad, I leaned back in my chair and grinned like a man who had just discovered fire. Karen thought she was building a shed. What she didn't realize was that she had just built herself a trap, and she had walked into it with both eyes open. The next morning, my phone blew up with inquiries. Apparently, affordable storage space was in high demand, and within a few hours, I had 5 serious offers. It was almost too easy. By noon, I had already scheduled a showing with a retired veteran named Mr. Sullivan, who needed a place to store his fishing gear and a few extra tools. When he saw the shed, he was ecstatic. I told him I'd give him a great deal on the rent if he signed that day. He agreed immediately. Papers were signed, cash deposit in hand. Just like that, Karen's illegal shed was officially bringing me passive income. I didn't even have to go looking for Karen. She found me. When she spotted Mr. Sullivan unloading some of his fishing rods into the shed, she came stomping over like an angry bull, demanding to know what was going on. I stayed calm, almost annoyingly so, as I pulled out a copy of the property deed and the rental contract I had drawn up. I explained, in the sweetest voice I could muster, that the shed was legally on my land, and as such I could do whatever I wanted with it, including renting it out to complete strangers. Her face turned such a deep shade of red I genuinely worried she might pass out. Karen sputtered and threatened to call the HOA lawyer, to which I simply smiled and told her to be my guest. I had the document, I had the law, and most importantly I had her shed. As she stormed away muttering something about unneighborly behavior, I couldn't help but chuckle. This was only the beginning. Karen had made the first move, sure. But I was going to make the last one, and it was going to be checkmate. Mason woke up the next morning with an unusual bounce in his step, like a kid who knew Christmas had come early. He had transformed overnight from a wronged neighbor into a full-fledged landlord, thanks to Karen's ridiculous miscalculation. As he brewed his coffee, the thought of Karen fuming while he legally profited from her little construction project made every sip taste sweeter. With the paperwork finalized with Mr. Sullivan the day before, Mason decided it was time to lean fully into his plan. He pulled out his laptop, crafted a few more rental ads with slightly different spins, one emphasizing it as an artist's retreat, another pitching it as a private workshop for hobbyists. Mason figured the more angles he worked, the more options he would have if Sullivan decided to back out later. Though the thought was unlikely, Mason preferred having layers to his plan, especially when dealing with someone as unpredictably spiteful as Karen. By early afternoon, he noticed the first few ripples of trouble brewing. Karen had gathered a small clique of her loyal HOA board members near the sidewalk, and they were huddled together whispering like a bunch of kids planning a prank. Mason pretended not to notice, whistling a tune as he power-washed his driveway, but his eyes were on them the whole time. He knew Karen would not accept defeat quietly. Sure enough, later that evening, Mason found a formal letter taped to his door. It was stamped with the official HOA letterhead and stated that he was being fined for an unauthorized structure on his property and given a notice to cease rental activities immediately. Mason laughed so hard he nearly dropped his dinner plate. Karen genuinely thought the HOA had any authority over his private property. It was like watching someone challenge a chess master without knowing how the pieces move. Mason carefully drafted a response, attaching copies of his property deed, the city zoning rules that confirmed his rights, and a beautifully worded letter that basically told the HOA to take their complaint and file it directly into the nearest trash bin. He dropped off the paperwork the next morning, hand-delivering it to the HOA office just in time to see Karen lurking behind the receptionist's desk, pretending to shuffle papers but clearly eavesdropping. He gave her a big, cheerful wave and left without saying a word. The silence he left behind was louder than any argument could have been. Not willing to let it go, Karen escalated her effort. 2 days later, Mason came home from work to find a bright orange notice stuck to the shed itself, declaring it non-compliant and ordering immediate removal. Mason didn't even bother getting angry. Instead, he snapped a few pictures, called the city zoning department, and within an hour had an official inspector at his property. The inspector, a friendly man named Dave, reviewed everything and shook his head with a chuckle. He confirmed that the shed, while hilariously misplaced, was completely legal since it sat on Mason's private land and met all local code. Dave even joked that Karen might want to spend more time reading zoning ordinances instead of issuing fake citations. While Mason was chatting with Dave, Mr. Sullivan arrived to drop off more fishing equipment. Karen, lurking like a hawk, swooped in again, yelling about HOA rights, neighborhood standards, and how Mason was creating an unsightly commercial district. Dave, bless him, calmly stepped in and explained the law in plain English while Karen's face morphed from furious red to a blotchy shade of purple. She sputtered a few threats about taking this higher before storming off, practically tripping over her own fury. The next few days were a circus of petty retaliation. Karen left anonymous complaints with the city claiming Mason was running an illegal business, which got promptly dismissed after city officials reviewed the rental agreement and property ownership documents. She then tried planting fake violations, like tossing trash around the shed and claiming Mason was a health hazard. Mason responded by installing motion sensor security cameras and posting the footage publicly on the neighborhood forum every time Karen or her cronies trespassed. The videos, complete with timestamps and slow-motion replays, became instant viral hits among the neighbors. People who had been quietly enduring Karen's reign of terror now openly laughed at her, emboldened by Mason's creative counterattacks. Meanwhile, Mason's little rental operation grew stronger. Mr. Sullivan loved the space, so much he recommended it to a few buddies, and Mason soon had a waiting list of people willing to rent the shed if Sullivan ever moved out. Encouraged, Mason even brainstormed ideas to further monetize the shed, seasonal storage for holiday decorations, maybe even a mini-artist co-op space. Each new idea felt like another nail in the coffin of Karen's dwindling authority. One evening, as Mason relaxed on his porch, he spotted an unfamiliar face walking briskly toward his house. It was Brian, one of the quieter members of the HOA board. Brian nervously introduced himself and then, glancing around to make sure no one was watching, handed Mason a USB drive. "You didn't get this from me," he whispered before hustling back to his car. Intrigued, Mason plugged the drive into his laptop and found a treasure trove. Dozens of emails between Karen and various HOA board members discussing plans to seize private homeowner property for so-called community improvements without ever notifying the residents or filing the proper paperwork. The emails were packed with phrases like, "they'll never know," and "just build it and deal with complaints later." Mason's jaw dropped. This wasn't just arrogance. This was premeditated abuse of authority. Now armed with evidence, Mason knew exactly what his next move would be. He drafted a detailed complaint to the city's zoning office, attaching screenshots of the emails along with copies of the fake violation notices Karen had sent him. He also CC'd the state HOA regulatory board, just for good measure. He didn't announce what he was doing. He simply waited, calm and patient, while Karen spun herself deeper into the web she had created. It was only a matter of time before the consequences she thought she could avoid came crashing down on her like a ton of improperly zoned brick. As the sun set that evening, Mason leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee and smiling. Karen thought she was building a shed to claim more power. Instead, she had built the foundation of her own downfall, and Mason was going to enjoy every minute of watching it unfold. The next few days unfolded like a slow, delicious symphony of disaster, with Karen conducting every wrong note herself. Mason hardly had to lift a finger. The complaint he filed with the city zoning office had triggered an official investigation far beyond just his little shed. Inspectors began making rounds through the neighborhood, and it didn't take them long to notice other violations. Temporary structures in public easements, storage units plopped on sidewalks, even a bizarre, half-finished gazebo Karen had authorized in the community park without a single permit. One by one, the city posted violation notices in bright, unavoidable neon colors, making the entire HOA look like it was hosting a fire sale of incompetence. Mason watched it all unfold with a casual detachment, sipping lemonade on his porch like he was watching a parade go by. It was the kind of victory that tasted better because it wasn't loud or messy. It was strategic, lawful, and irreversible. Meanwhile, Karen was unraveling publicly. She called an emergency HOA board meeting, sending out dramatic emails about outside threats and homeowner sabotage, trying to rally the neighbors against Mason. But when the day came, the meeting turned into a complete disaster. Half the homeowners showed up furious, not because of Mason, but because of Karen's sneaky plans to annex their properties without so much as a discussion. Mason attended too, casually sitting in the back with a thick folder of documents. When Karen tried to paint him as a rogue troublemaker, he simply stood up, handed copies of the damning emails to everyone present, and sat back down without saying a word. The room went dead silent as page after page revealed how deeply Karen had manipulated the system for her own benefit. One older gentleman named Mr. Hawthorne, who had lived in the neighborhood for over 40 years, practically erupted with fury after reading the emails. He demanded an immediate vote of no confidence in Karen's leadership. Others chimed in, shouting questions about missing HOA funds, unauthorized landscaping projects, and fines that had mysteriously appeared on their accounts without explanation. Karen tried to regain control, raising her voice, waving her hands, blaming Mason, blaming the city, blaming ungrateful residents, but the more she spoke, the worse it got. The board members she once controlled like puppets began distancing themselves from her faster than rats fleeing a sinking ship. The climax of the meeting came when Brian, the soft-spoken board member who had handed Mason the USB drive, stood up and admitted he had been pressured into signing off on multiple illegal projects under threat of being fined or removed from the board himself. His quiet, honest confession carried far more weight than all of Karen's frantic shouting. In one crushing moment, the homeowners voted overwhelmingly to remove Karen as HOA president effective immediately. She sat frozen in her seat, stunned as the gavel slammed down. Just like that, her little empire crumbled into dust. But karma, as Mason knew, wasn't quite finished yet. The city officials, upon reviewing Karen's multiple violations, decided to hold her personally responsible for the unauthorized constructions she had spearheaded. Fines began rolling in, not just against the HOA, but against Karen individually. Thousands of dollars in penalties stacked up almost overnight. It turned out that when you build on public land without permission, ignore zoning codes, and falsify HOA documents, the law doesn't look kindly upon it. Karen tried appealing the fines, but the evidence was overwhelming. Worse, her appeals only bought her a few weeks' delay before even harsher penalties kicked in. Faced with a financial tsunami and no HOA slush fund to bail her out, Karen began liquidating anything she could to cover the mounting bills. Word quickly spread that she had put her prized SUV up for sale and had started cashing out retirement accounts. Mason heard rumors from a neighbor that she had even tried renting out a room in her house, although nobody wanted to live with the most hated woman in the neighborhood. Ironically, the only rental that was in hot demand was the shed Mason had listed, the very shed Karen had so arrogantly built on someone else's land. Seeing an opportunity too good to pass up, Mason adjusted the shed's rental listing. He bumped the price a little higher, citing rising market demand. When Karen realized that the shed could be a steady income stream if she had access to it, she swallowed her pride and approached Mason to propose a buyout. Mason, savoring every second, politely declined. He explained that he was perfectly happy renting it out monthly and that he even had plans to install solar panels to make it an eco-friendly mini-unit. Karen's expression at that moment was a masterpiece of rage and defeat, a priceless portrait Mason would treasure forever in his memory. Unable to purchase the shed back and desperate for cash, Karen made a shocking proposal. She asked if she could rent the shed herself. Mason pretended to think it over very seriously for a few minutes, pacing back and forth like he was weighing a monumental decision. Finally, he agreed, but only if she paid 3 months' rent up front, plus a hefty security deposit. He wrote the terms into an ironclad contract and handed it to her with a smile so sweet it could rot teeth. Karen, cornered and humiliated beyond words, signed the papers. Mason took great satisfaction in watching her shaky hand scrawl her name across the rental agreement. From that day on, Karen had to come every month, tail tucked firmly between her legs, to drop off her rent payment. Mason made sure the transactions were as public as possible, sometimes inviting a few neighbors over for casual gatherings on rent day. The neighbors, once too intimidated to even question Karen, now openly chuckled and exchanged knowing smiles whenever they saw her making the walk of shame toward Mason's porch. No one said anything cruel to her face. No one needed to. The sheer weight of her downfall did all the talking. As the months passed, Mason continued to enjoy the irony. He used the extra income from the shed to pay down his mortgage faster, and even started a little savings fund labeled Karen's Shed Scholarship as an inside joke. Every time he glanced out his window and saw the modest little shed standing proudly at the edge of his yard, he was reminded of a simple truth. Sometimes the best revenge isn't loud or violent. Sometimes the best revenge is living well, profiting legally, and watching the people who tried to crush you end up funding your success. Mason had never been one to gloat openly, but watching Karen squirm month after month made it almost impossible not to let a smug grin slip across his face now and then. As the seasons shifted and summer rolled into a blazing heatwave, the shed continued to earn its keep. Mason used part of the rental income to make small upgrades that turned the once basic structure into a real hidden gem. He installed solar-powered lights, insulated the walls for better temperature control, and even added a small security system. Each improvement made the rental more valuable, and each upgrade was another reminder to Karen that her arrogance had built something she could never take back. Neighbors often stopped by to ask how he had managed to turn such a ridiculous situation into a personal goldmine, and Mason always replied with a wink and a simple, "Karen helped." The HOA, now under new leadership, was doing its best to clean up the mess Karen had left behind, but the financial scars ran deep. Special assessments had to be levied to cover legal fees and city fines, and although the new president worked hard to be transparent, the community's trust would take time to rebuild. Meanwhile, Karen became somewhat of a ghost in the neighborhood. She no longer marched around barking orders or inspecting people's flower beds with a ruler. Instead, she slunk from her house to her car with her head down, barely acknowledging anyone. The woman who once wielded her power like a sword was now nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered about at block parties and backyard barbecues. Mason thought the story was just about over until a thick envelope arrived in his mailbox one Thursday afternoon. It was from the city's zoning enforcement office, and inside was an official notice that Karen's personal property had been reclassified. Due to her numerous violations, the city had flagged her backyard structures for removal if she could not prove legal compliance. In short, she was now facing an even bigger financial nightmare. Her precious gazebo, her tool sheds, her illegally widened patio, all of it had to either be permitted at great cost or demolished within 60 days. Mason laughed so hard he had to sit down on the front steps to catch his breath. It was almost too perfect. She had fought so hard to control every inch of everyone else's land, and now she was losing her own piece by piece. The best part was that Mason had nothing to do with it. Karen's downfall had gathered so much momentum that even if he disappeared off the face of the earth, the situation would still come crashing down on her. Karma wasn't just knocking on her door. It had kicked it off the hinges and was redecorating the living room. Karen, desperate to salvage whatever dignity she had left, put her house up for sale. She tried to list it quietly at first, hoping to avoid attention, but in a neighborhood where gossip traveled faster than light, the news was public knowledge within hours. The listing didn't go well. Potential buyers found out about the HOA chaos, the city violations, and the endless drama, and they backed out faster than Karen could schedule showings. As the financial pressure mounted, Karen made a final, pathetic attempt to reclaim the shed. She approached Mason again, this time with a forced smile that made her look like she had just swallowed a lemon whole. She offered him double the shed's supposed value if he would sell it back to her. Mason, feigning deep thought, politely declined. He told her the shed had sentimental value now, and that no amount of money could replace the memories it had created. It was a lie, of course, but one that tasted sweeter than the truth. Karen left in a huff, slamming her car door so hard it echoed down the street like a cannon blast. A few days later, Mason decided it was time to turn the final screw. He hosted a neighborhood yard sale event and set up a booth right next to the shed. He put up a huge, colorful banner that read, "Come see the most profitable shed in town. Built by Karen, now funding my vacations." The neighbors loved it. People came by not just to shop but to take selfies with the shed, laughing and exchanging stories about Karen's reign of terror. Some brought their lawn chairs just to sit and watch the steady stream of visitors admiring the little building that had become a symbol of poetic justice. Karen, trapped inside her house with the windows tightly shut, could only peek through the blinds and seethe. Every laugh, every camera flash, every delighted voice praising Mason's cleverness was a dagger to her pride. Mason didn't need to confront her directly. She was trapped in a prison of her own making, with walls built from her arrogance and floors paved with her bad decisions. There was no escape from it, no way to spin the story in her favor. Everyone knew the truth now, and there was no hiding from it. As the sun set on the day of the yard sale, Mason sat on his porch with a glass of iced tea in hand, watching the last few neighbors pack up their tables. Kids ran laughing through the street, people clinked glasses and grilled burgers, and for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt like a real community again. The tension and fear that Karen had brought with her rule had evaporated, replaced by something far better: laughter, unity, and a shared understanding that no bully, no matter how powerful they thought they were, could stand against a community willing to fight back smartly. Mason knew life would eventually move on. New challenges would come, new issues would arise, but the memory of what happened would stay with them forever. The shed would stand as a quiet monument to resilience and wit, a daily reminder that sometimes you didn't need to fight fire with fire. Sometimes you just needed to stay calm, stay smart, and let your enemies set themselves on fire. As darkness fell and the porch lights clicked on up and down the street, Mason raised his glass in a silent toast. To Karen's shed, to karma, and to the sweet, satisfying taste of victory earned without lifting a single hammer. Summer slipped into fall, but the legend of Karen's shed remained as fresh as ever. Mason continued to rent it out to Mr. Sullivan, who had settled into the space as if it were his own personal fortress of solitude. Fishing gear, lawn chairs, even a small radio sat neatly inside, and Mr. Sullivan often waved to Mason from the doorway, offering a thumbs up whenever the topic of the finest shed in town came up. The neighborhood had fully embraced the story, and the shed itself had become something of a tourist attraction among the residents. People brought their friends over just to point it out, chuckling as they explained how Karen had built her own monthly bill without realizing it. Mason had considered installing a small commemorative plaque on the door, but decided it was better to let the laughter and quiet understanding do the talking. Some victories didn't need brass plates to be immortalized. Karen's attempts to sell her house continued to fail spectacularly. Every time a potential buyer toured the property, it didn't take long for someone to casually mention the HOA drama or the massive list of fines still hanging over the place like a rain cloud. Mason didn't even have to interfere. The truth had seeped into the very soil of the neighborhood, passed along through whispered conversations and the kind of communal memory that never quite fades. Eventually, Karen gave up entirely, pulling the listing and retreating further into her crumbling fortress. She stopped attending neighborhood events, stopped holding meetings, and even stopped making eye contact with anyone who crossed her path. In a way, it was sad, watching someone who had once strutted around like a queen now reduced to a shadow. But Mason reminded himself that Karen's fall had been built brick by her own hand. Mason's life, on the other hand, thrived. Without Karen's endless meddling, the HOA found its footing under the leadership of reasonable, kind neighbors who understood that community was built on cooperation, not control. Block parties were bigger, the park saw more volunteer days, and families who had once kept to themselves began to open up. Mason threw a small celebration of his own, inviting a few close friends over for a cookout beside the shed. He strung up fairy lights around it, served drinks from a cooler placed right next to the door, and toasted to the absurdity of it all. It wasn't every day you got to celebrate turning an enemy's arrogance into a monthly income stream. During that cookout, Brian, the quiet board member who had originally slipped Mason the incriminating emails, pulled him aside. He laughed and said that he had a running bet with his wife about when Karen would finally move out. Mason chuckled and said he figured she was too stubborn to leave, even when it would be the smartest move she could make. Brian shook his head and said, "She's already gone, in every way that matters. She's just waiting for the world to notice." Mason thought about that for a moment and realized he was right. Karen's influence had evaporated, and without power, she was just another unhappy neighbor with too much baggage and not enough sense to start fresh somewhere else. One crisp morning, Mason was out watering his garden when he noticed a moving truck idling in front of Karen's house. For a moment, he didn't believe it. He put down the hose and watched, almost hypnotized, as movers carried out box after box, furniture wrapped in plastic, and Karen's once pristine decor now reduced to mere cargo. Karen herself stood on the porch, arms crossed, jaw tight, overseeing the process with a grim expression that didn't soften even when one of the movers tried to make small talk. There were no tearful goodbyes, no neighbors coming by to wish her well. Just the hollow sounds of tape being ripped off rolls and the low rumble of dollies rolling over concrete. Mason thought about waving but decided against it. Some endings didn't need words. They just needed to happen. As the truck finally pulled away, Karen's car following behind it like a reluctant caboose, Mason felt a strange mix of emotions. Satisfaction, certainly, but also a twinge of pity. It wasn't that he wished her well, far from it, but he couldn't help but feel amazed at how thoroughly she had orchestrated her own downfall. There was a kind of tragic poetry to it, like watching a villain in a play deliver their final, inevitable soliloquy before disappearing into the wings forever. With Karen gone, the neighborhood truly blossomed. The once tense air felt lighter. People walked their dogs more often, kids played in the street without parents nervously glancing out the windows, and backyard barbecues became weekend norms. The shed, still standing proudly at the edge of Mason's property, remained a symbol of the community's quiet resilience. Mason even installed a little garden around it, planting sunflowers and marigolds that framed the building like a crown. Passers-by often complimented him on the beautiful arrangement, and Mason would just nod and smile, never mentioning the long, ridiculous story behind it unless someone asked. Those who knew, though, grinned a little wider whenever they saw it. Months later, at the HOA's annual neighborhood fair, Mason was presented with a tongue-in-cheek award, a small golden hammer mounted on a wooden base, engraved with the words "Neighborhood Hero, 4 services in creative problem solving." Everyone roared with laughter when Mason accepted it, holding it high like a championship trophy. It wasn't just an award for the shed, or even for standing up to Karen. It was an award for what he had helped restore, the sense that a neighborhood could be a place of laughter, support, and shared strength rather than fear and petty tyranny. As Mason sat on his porch that evening, watching the lights from the fair still twinkling faintly in the distance, he thought back to the first moment he had seen that shed being built. The disbelief, the anger, the temptation to blow up and escalate everything right then and there. But he was glad he hadn't. He was glad he had chosen a smarter, calmer path. Because real victory wasn't just about winning a fight. It was about building something lasting in the ashes of what someone else tried to destroy. Karen had tried to take something from him, and in return, he had built a monument to patience, wit, and the quiet power of community. The shed stood quietly in the evening breeze, the fairy lights Mason had strung around it gently swaying. A few neighborhood kids rode past on their bikes, laughing, the sound carrying on the wind. Somewhere a dog barked, and someone's sprinkler clicked on with a soft hiss. Life went on, a little brighter, a little kinder. Mason leaned back in his chair, raised his glass toward the shed in a silent salute, and smiled. Karen was gone, but her greatest creation remained, not as a symbol of her power, but of her ultimate defeat. And Mason, in the end, got everything he wanted without ever breaking a single rule. That, he thought, was the sweetest victory of all.